The first radio began weeping on the 7th day of October, though no one in Hollow Marsh would understand what it meant until much later. Eleanor Vance heard it at 3:47 in the morning, a soft, wet sound bleeding through the speakers of her grandfather's Zenith console, the one that hadn't worked since 1987. She had kept it in the corner of her living room as a memorial, its walnut cabinet gathering dust, its dial frozen on a frequency that no longer existed. But that night it spoke. Not words at first. Just breathing. The ragged, waterlogged respiration of something that had forgotten how lungs were supposed to work. Eleanor would later tell Sheriff Marcus Holden that she thought it was a dream. She had been sleeping on the couch, surrounded by cardboard boxes she couldn't bring herself to unpack since returning to her childhood home 3 months prior. The house still smelled like her grandmother's lavender sachets, though the old woman had been dead for 2 years. Eleanor had inherited everything: the creaking Victorian on Sedge Lane, the overgrown garden, the silence that pressed against the windows like something wanting in. The breathing lasted for 11 minutes. Eleanor timed it on her phone, too afraid to move, watching the green glow of the Zenith's dial illuminate with a light that had no source. When it stopped, she heard a voice she recognized. "Ellie. The water's so warm." Her brother David had been missing for 16 years. He had walked into Hollow Marsh on his 19th birthday and never walked out. The town itself was a wound in the landscape of coastal Maine, 40 miles from anything that could be called civilization. It had been built in the 1840s by settlers who believed the wetlands held some kind of mineral wealth, and it had been dying ever since they discovered otherwise. The marsh surrounded the community on 3 sides, a labyrinth of black water, cattails, and fog that could swallow sound itself. The 4th side faced the Atlantic, though the ocean here was not the picturesque coastline of tourist brochures. It was gray and cold and hungry, and the locals had learned long ago not to trust it. 1,700 people lived in Hollow Marsh at its peak in 1952. By the time Eleanor returned, there were fewer than 300, most of them elderly, most of them waiting to die in the same houses where they had been born. The young left as soon as they could afford to. The ones who couldn't afford to simply disappeared. The missing persons registry for Hollow Marsh dated back to 1891, when the first town clerk began keeping official records. Eleanor found it in the basement of the municipal building during her second week back, while researching property lines for a dispute with a neighbor who had long since moved away. The registry was a leather-bound ledger, its pages brown and brittle, filled with names written in fading ink. Abigail Turner, age 23. Last seen October 3, 1891. Walking toward the eastern marsh. Never found. Thomas Whitmore, age 45. Last seen October 11, 1891. His boat discovered empty in Griever's Inlet. Never found. Mary Catherine Stone, age 8. Last seen October 19, 1891. Playing near the water's edge behind the old cannery. Never found. The pattern repeated year after year, decade after decade. Always October. Always the marsh. Always never found. Eleanor counted 247 names before she stopped. That was just through 1950. Sheriff Marcus Holden was 63 years old and had held his position for 31 years. He was a large man with hands like shovels and eyes that had seen too much to believe in anything simple. When Eleanor came to his office the morning after the radio incident, he listened without interrupting, his coffee growing cold in front of him. "You're not the first," he said when she finished. "You won't be the last." He pulled a folder from his desk drawer. Inside were reports dating back to 1978, handwritten testimonies from Hollow Marsh residents who had heard voices from dead electronics. Radios mostly. Sometimes televisions. Once, an 8-track player in the cab of a truck that had been rusting in someone's barn for 20 years. "It happens every October," Marcus explained. "Started keeping records when I took this job. Thought maybe I could find a pattern, some kind of explanation. Radio interference from the naval station down the coast, maybe. Swamp gas affecting electrical equipment. Something scientific. And I stopped looking for explanations about 15 years ago. Right around the time I started hearing my father's voice coming out of my car stereo." Eleanor's hands trembled as she read through the reports. The testimonies were remarkably consistent. The radios always activated between 2 and 4 a.m. They always spoke in the voices of people who had gone missing in the marsh. The voices always said the same thing more or less. "The water's warm. Come find me. I'm waiting for you. I miss you so much." "Has anyone ever gone?" Eleanor asked. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he opened another drawer and pulled out a second folder, much thicker than the first. "This is everyone who's disappeared since I became sheriff. 47 names. Want to know how many of them had reported hearing voices from their radios in the week before they vanished? How many? All of them. Eleanor spent the next 3 days researching the history of Hollow Marsh, driven by something she couldn't name, something between grief and terror and a desperate need to understand. The town library was a single room in the back of the post office, staffed by a woman named Vera Cunningham who had been the librarian since 1969. Vera was 91 years old, her mind still sharp as broken glass, and she remembered everything. It started with the drownings, Vera said, helping Eleanor navigate the archives. Or maybe it started before that, with whatever made people drown in the first place. The marsh isn't natural, you know. The water's too still. Even when the wind blows hard enough to knock down trees, the marsh never ripples. Like it's holding its breath. The earliest drownings on record occurred in 1847, just 3 years after the town was founded. A family of 5, the Corbins, walked into the marsh one October evening and never returned. Their bodies were found a week later, floating in the shallows near what would become Griever's Inlet. The coroner's report noted that their lungs were full of water, but their faces bore expressions of profound contentment, as if they had welcomed their deaths. That's when the voices started, Vera continued. The Corbins had a neighbor, a woman named Sarah DeWitt. She swore she heard them calling to her from her son's music box, 2 nights after they were found. The music box had belonged to the youngest Corbin girl. Sarah had kept it as a memento. She said they told her the water was warm. That they were happy. That she should come join them. Did she? Vera's smile was thin and joyless. Sarah DeWitt disappeared on October 31, 1847. Her body was never recovered. The pattern crystallized over the following century and a half. Every October the radios would wake. Every October the voices would call. And every October someone would walk into the marsh and never return. Eleanor found David's missing persons report in Marcus's files, typed on a form that seemed too ordinary for the horror it contained. Name, David Allen Vance. Age, 19. Date last seen, October 15, 2009. Location last seen, Sedge Lane, Hollow Marsh, Maine. Description, Caucasian male, 5 feet 11 inches, 165 pounds, brown hair, blue eyes. Last seen wearing jeans, gray hoodie, white sneakers. Circumstances, subject left family residence at approximately 11 p.m., stating he was going for a walk. Did not return. Search of surrounding marsh conducted October 16 to 23. No remains or personal effects recovered. Status, missing, presumed deceased. Eleanor remembered that night. She had been 15, home from boarding school for fall break. David had been acting strange for weeks, quiet, distracted, spending hours staring at their grandfather's old radio. She had assumed it was drugs or girl trouble, or the general malaise of being 19 in a dying town with no future. She hadn't known about the voices. Not then. The night before David disappeared, Eleanor had found him sitting in the dark living room at 3 a.m., his face lit by the green glow of the zenith's dial. "Do you hear that?" he had whispered. Eleanor had heard nothing but static. "Mom's calling me," David said. "She says she's waiting." Their mother had drowned in the marsh when Eleanor was 6 years old. An accident, they said. She had been gathering cattails for a centerpiece, stepped into deeper water than she expected, and never surfaced. Her body was recovered 2 days later, her face bearing that same expression of profound contentment noted in the Corbin case over 150 years earlier. Eleanor had not heard her mother's voice that night in 2009. But David had. And the next evening he walked into the marsh to find her. On the 10th night of October 2025, Eleanor woke to find her grandfather's radio playing again. This time the voice was not her brother's. "Ellie. Oh, Ellie, I've missed you so much." It was her mother. The voice was exactly as Eleanor remembered it, warm and soft and slightly hoarse, the way it had sounded when her mother would read her bedtime stories about princes and dragons and happily ever afters. But there was something beneath it now, something wet and wrong, like words being spoken through a mouth full of water. "The marsh is so beautiful at night, Ellie. The stars reflect in the water like scattered diamonds. You used to love looking at stars, remember? You'd make me name all the constellations, even the ones I had to invent." Eleanor pressed herself against the far wall of the living room, as far from the radio as she could get without leaving the house. Her phone was in her hand, but she couldn't seem to make herself dial. Some part of her, some desperate and broken part, wanted to keep listening. "Your brother is here with me. David says hello. He misses you too. We all miss you, Ellie. Why don't you come visit? The water's so warm. It feels like being held." Like coming home. The broadcast lasted 43 minutes. Eleanor recorded every second on her phone, her hands shaking so badly that the audio would later prove difficult to decipher. When the voice finally faded and the radio went silent, she sat in the dark until dawn, afraid to move, afraid to close her eyes, afraid that if she looked away for even a moment, she would find herself walking toward the marsh without remembering how she got there. At 7 a.m., she called Sheriff Holden. By noon, 6 other residents had reported similar experiences. Marcus gathered them in the community center, a converted church that had lost its congregation in the 1990s when the last minister moved away and no one applied to replace him. The windows were still stained glass, throwing colored light across the faces of the assembled townspeople. It made them look like they were already dead, already beatified, already gone. The witnesses were an unlikely group. There was Eleanor, still pale and trembling. There was Gerald Fitch, 87 years old, who had heard his wife Margaret calling from the transistor radio in his kitchen. Margaret had disappeared in October 1991. There was Delia Santos, 34, a nurse at the regional hospital 20 miles away, who had heard her son Tommy speaking through the clock radio in her bedroom. Tommy had drowned in the marsh 2 years ago, just 8 years old, chasing a dog that the family had never owned. There was Harrison Wells, 52, the town's only mechanic, who had heard his twin brother Henry through the radio in a 1965 Mustang he was restoring. Henry had walked into the marsh on their 40th birthday, 12 years prior, saying he needed to clear his head. The others were similar. Each had lost someone to the marsh. Each had heard that person calling them home. "It's starting again," Gerald Fitch said, his voice quavering. "Same as always. It wants more of us." "What is it?" Delia asked. "What are we actually talking about here?" "I'm a nurse. I believe in science and rational explanations. What you're describing isn't possible." "Try telling that to your radio," Harrison said. Marcus raised his hands for silence. "I know how this sounds. I know what you're all thinking. But I've been dealing with this for 30 years and I'm telling you, it doesn't matter if you believe it. What matters is that we get through October without anyone else disappearing." He explained the protocols he had developed over the decades. No one goes near the marsh after dark. No one listens to radio broadcasts alone. If you hear a voice, leave the room immediately. Unplug every radio, television, and electronic device in your house. Sleep with someone else in the room if possible. The voices seem to target isolated individuals. "And whatever you do," Marcus concluded, "whatever they say, however much they sound like your loved ones, do not go to them. Do not follow the voices. The moment you step into that marsh at night, you're gone." "But what is it?" Delia pressed. "What's causing this?" Marcus looked older than his years in that moment, the weight of 3 decades of impossible burden pressing down on his shoulders. "I have a theory," he said. "I don't like it, but it's the only explanation that fits the evidence." He turned to a corkboard covered in photographs, missing persons from throughout Hollow Marsh's history. Men, women, children. Faces captured in black and white and faded color, all of them smiling, none of them aware of what was coming. "The marsh remembers them," Marcus said. "Every person who has ever drowned in that water, every voice that has ever been silenced beneath its surface, the marsh keeps them, absorbs them. And every October, when the veil between whatever the marsh is and whatever we are grows thin, it uses those memories to call for more." "That's not science," Delia said. "No," Marcus agreed. "It's not." After the meeting, Eleanor remained behind. She had been carrying her phone in her pocket, the recording from the previous night burning against her thigh like a physical weight. She approached Marcus as he was taking down the photographs. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Marcus didn't turn around. "Ask. Have you ever gone to the marsh?" After hearing the voices? The sheriff's hand stopped moving. He was silent for a long moment. "Once," he said finally. "In 1994. I heard my father calling me from the radio in my patrol car. He'd been missing for 11 years at that point. I drove to Griever's Inlet at 2 a.m., got out of the car and walked to the water's edge." "What happened?" "I saw something. In the water. It looked like my father. Same face, same build, same way of standing with his hands in his pockets. He was waist deep in the marsh and he was smiling at me. Telling me to come in, that the water was warm, that he'd missed me. But you didn't go." Marcus finally turned to face her. His eyes were wet. "I almost did. I had one foot in the water before I realized something was wrong. My father had a scar on his left cheek, got it in the Korean War. This thing in the water didn't have the scar. It had everything else right, every other detail perfect, but it didn't have the scar. Because the marsh doesn't remember scars. It only remembers the parts of people that it consumes. The parts that drown. Eleanor felt ice spreading through her chest. What did you do? I ran. Got in my car and drove until I couldn't see the marsh anymore. When I came back the next morning there was nothing there. Just water and fog and silence. And the voices? Still come every October. Still use my father's voice. I just don't listen anymore. That night, Eleanor did something she knew she shouldn't. She drove to the edge of the marsh. She told herself she was being scientific, gathering evidence, approaching the situation like the journalist she had once been before the layoffs and the economy and the slow death of print media had driven her back to her grandmother's house. She brought her phone, a flashlight, a voice recorder, and a can of pepper spray, as if any of those things could protect her from whatever lived in the black water. The marsh at night was everything Vera Cunningham had described and worse. The water was glass still despite a steady wind coming off the Atlantic. The cattails didn't move, didn't rustle, stood like silent sentinels guarding something they would never reveal. The fog hung low and thick, glowing faintly in the moonlight, obscuring anything more than 20 feet away. Eleanor parked her car on the shoulder of Marsh Road and approached the water's edge. The beam of her flashlight cut through the fog but revealed nothing except more fog, more water, more emptiness. She stood there for perhaps 10 minutes, waiting for something to happen. The silence was absolute. No frogs, no insects, no night birds. Just the wet sound of her own breathing. Then, somewhere in the marsh, she heard a voice. Ellie. Was David. She would recognize her brother's voice anywhere. Ellie, I know you're there. I can see your light. The voice was coming from deep in the marsh, from somewhere in the fog. Eleanor felt her feet moving toward the water before she consciously decided to follow. Stop, she said aloud. Stop, stop, stop. She forced herself backward, away from the water, until she felt the gravel of the road beneath her shoes. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. I just want to talk, David's voice continued. I know you're scared. I was scared too at first. But it's so peaceful here, Ellie. Mom's here. Grandma's here. Everyone's here. We're waiting for you. You're not David, Eleanor said, her voice trembling. David is dead. Silence. Then laughter, soft, wet, wrong. Aren't we all, Ellie? Aren't we all dead in the end? The fog began to move. Not in response to the wind, but against it, rolling toward Eleanor, reaching for her like hands made of vapor. In its depths she glimpsed shapes. Faces. Hundreds of faces, all of them watching her with eyes that held no light. Eleanor ran. She drove back to town at 90 miles an hour, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the steering wheel. When she got home she found every radio in her house turned on, all of them tuned to the same frequency, all of them speaking in unison. We're waiting, Ellie. We're all waiting. She unplugged them all. Then she sat in the corner of her kitchen with her back against the wall, clutching her pepper spray, and waited for dawn. The disappearances began 3 days later. Gerald Fitch was the first. His neighbor found his front door open at 7 a.m., his breakfast still cooking on the stove, his transistor radio tuned to a dead frequency and playing static so loud it could be heard from the street. His footprints led from his back porch to the edge of the marsh, where they vanished into the black water. They searched for 3 days. They found nothing. Eleanor helped organize the search parties, more out of a need to do something than any real hope of success. She had read the registry, had counted the names, 247 through 1950, and God knew how many since. No one who walked into the marsh during October ever walked out. The second disappearance happened on October 18th. Delia Santos had been on the night shift at the hospital when she received a call from her babysitter. Tommy, the babysitter said. Tommy's voice was coming from the baby monitor. Tommy was saying he wanted his mommy to come play with him in the water. Delia left the hospital at 11 p.m. Her car was found the next morning at Griever's Inlet. The driver's door was open, the engine still running, and the radio was playing her son's voice on repeat. Mommy, come play. Mommy, come play. Mommy, come play. The remaining witnesses from Marcus's meeting began to fracture. Harrison Wells barricaded himself in his garage and refused to come out. 2 families packed their cars and fled to relatives out of state, though Eleanor would later learn that they heard the voices even there. Heard them through hotel clock radios, through car stereos, through the speakers of their smartphones. The marsh, it seemed, was not bound by geography. It could reach as far as it needed to reach. Eleanor began keeping a journal. She had been trained as a journalist, and old habits die hard. If she was going to die in this town, she wanted to leave some record of how it happened. October 19th. The radios are getting louder. Not just at night anymore. I heard David's voice coming from my car stereo at noon today, clear as day, asking me why I was avoiding him. Asked if I was angry about something. Said he was sorry if he'd upset me. Like he was still alive. Like nothing had happened. Sheriff Holden came by this evening. He looks like he hasn't slept in days. He told me that in 30 years of watching October come and go, he's never seen it this bad. Usually the marsh takes 1 or 2 people, 3 at most. This year it's hungry. His word, not mine. Hungry. I asked him what we should do. He said we should pray. Then he laughed and said God doesn't come to Hollow Marsh in October. Nothing comes to Hollow Marsh in October except the fog. October 20th. Vera Cunningham died last night. Natural causes, they're saying. She was 91 years old after all. But I saw her yesterday afternoon in the library, and she was terrified. She told me she'd been hearing voices all week. Not just one voice, dozens. Hundreds. Everyone who had ever drowned in the marsh, all speaking at once, asking her to come home. She was the town librarian for 56 years. She must have known so many people who disappeared. Marcus thinks the marsh took her anyway. Not her body, that's still at the funeral home, waiting for a service no one will attend. But her memories, her voice, her essence. Whatever the marsh consumes when it consumes a person. He thinks the marsh is building something. Growing stronger. Storing up voices for some purpose we can't understand. I think he might be right. October 21st. I went back to the municipal building today. Looked through records I hadn't examined before, not just the missing persons registry but everything. Land surveys, town council minutes, personal correspondence archived by the Historical Society. I was looking for something, anything that might explain what's happening. I found it in a letter dated November 3, 1891, 2 days after Sarah DeWitt disappeared. It was written by a man named Ezra Holloway, the town's first pastor, addressed to a colleague in Boston. The letter was never sent. It was found in Holloway's desk after he himself vanished 3 days later. I'm transcribing the relevant passages here, exactly as written. My dear brother in Christ. I write to you in a state of profound disturbance. I have witnessed things in this town that challenge everything I believed about the nature of God and the ordering of His creation. I fear that I may not survive the month, but if this letter reaches you, know that what I describe is the truth as I witnessed it. The marsh is not natural. I have long suspected this, but now I am certain. It is a wound in the fabric of creation, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead has worn thin. Something dwells within it, something old, something hungry, something that wears the faces of the dead like masks. I have seen them. The Corbins who drowned in 1847. Sarah DeWitt who followed them into the water. Others I do not recognize, faces from before the founding of our town, perhaps from before there were names for such things. They stand in the marsh at night, visible through the fog, calling to the living in voices that cannot be denied. But they are not the ones who drowned. The real victims are gone, absorbed, their essences scattered like drops of water in an ocean. What calls from the marsh is something else. Something that has learned to speak with stolen tongues, that has learned to wear stolen faces. It mimics love because it does not understand love. It promises warmth because it has never felt warmth. It is the memory of humanity without the soul. I have prayed for guidance. God has not answered. Perhaps He cannot hear me here. Perhaps this place exists outside His sight, in some shadow He cannot or will not illuminate. I do not know what the marsh wants. I do not know why it hungers. But I know that it will not stop, cannot stop, until it has consumed every voice that has ever existed. Until there is nothing left but static. The letter ended there. Ezra Holloway's body was never found. Eleanor read the letter 3 times. Then she walked to the window of her grandmother's house and looked out at the marsh, visible as a dark line on the horizon. Something that wears the faces of the dead like masks. She thought about her mother's voice coming through the radio. Thought about David calling her name from the fog. Thought about all those faces she had glimpsed in the marsh, hundreds of them watching, waiting. They weren't her family. They were something else. Something wearing her family's faces. That night, the radio in her living room turned on without being plugged in. Ellie, her mother's voice said, I know what you're thinking. I know you're trying to understand. But there's nothing to understand, sweetheart. There's only the water and the peace that comes after. Eleanor stood in the doorway watching the green glow of the dial. You're not my mother, she said. Static. Then laughter, the same wet, wrong laughter she had heard at the marsh. No, the voice admitted. I'm not. What are you? I am what remains. The echo after the song. The static between stations. I am everything that has ever drowned and everything that will ever drown and everything in between. I am the marsh, Eleanor Vance. And you are already mine. I haven't gone into the water. Not yet. But you will. They all do, eventually. The living cannot resist the call of the dead. It is the oldest story there is. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face. My mother didn't call me. My brother didn't call me. They're dead, really dead, and whatever you are, you don't have the right to use their voices. I have every right, the thing in the radio said. I have their memories. I have their final breaths. I have the moments of perfect peace they experienced as the water filled their lungs and the fear finally stopped. They gave me everything in those moments. They gave me themselves. And now they are me and I am them, and we are calling you home, Eleanor. We are waiting. Why? Eleanor screamed. Why do you do this? What do you want? The radio was silent for a long moment. When it spoke again, the voice had changed. It was no longer her mother's voice or David's or anyone she recognized. It was a chorus, hundreds of voices speaking in unison, overlapping and blending until they became something else entirely. A sound that was almost music. A sound that was almost static. I am incomplete, the chorus said. I have been incomplete since the beginning. Every voice I take becomes part of me, but it is never enough. I need more. I need everyone. I need every voice that has ever existed, every memory, every dream, every fear. Only then will I be whole. That's insane. Perhaps. But it is also true. And you, Eleanor Vance, have a very particular voice. A voice I have been waiting for. A voice that could complete me in ways you cannot imagine. Why me? The chorus laughed, a sound like drowning. Because you came back. Because you heard the call and you didn't run. Because some part of you wants this. Some part of you has always wanted to join your mother and your brother in the water. Some part of you has been waiting to come home. Eleanor pulled the radio from the wall and threw it against the floor. The casing shattered. The dial went dark. But the voice continued, coming now from everywhere and nowhere, from the walls, from the ceiling, from the fog pressing against the windows. You cannot destroy me. I am the marsh. I am the water. I am the static between stations. I have been here since before there were names for things, and I will be here long after your town has crumbled to dust. The only choice you have is whether you come willingly or whether I drag you in screaming. Either way, Eleanor Vance, you will be mine. Then silence. True silence, so absolute it was almost worse than the voice. Eleanor sat on her floor surrounded by shattered radio components and wept until dawn. The next 3 days were a waking nightmare. Eleanor stopped sleeping, surviving on caffeine and terror. She documented everything, every voice that came through her remaining electronics, every sighting of strange shapes in the fog, every moment of creeping dread that told her the marsh was watching, always watching. Sheriff Marcus Holden was the next to disappear. October 24th. The journal entry was brief, written in a hand that shook. Marcus is gone. Found his patrol car at the edge of the marsh this morning, doors open, radio playing static. No footprints leading to the water, just the car, just the static, just the absence where a man used to be. I'm alone now. The only one left from the meeting. Harrison Wells was found in his garage yesterday. He'd been dead for at least 2 days, but his cause of death wasn't natural. The coroner said his lungs were full of water. He drowned without ever leaving his garage. The marsh brought the water to him. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to fight something like this. I don't even know if it can be fought. But I'm not going to walk into that water. Whatever happens, I'm not going to give it the satisfaction. The remaining residents of Hollow Marsh had begun to evacuate, not because of any official order, but because they felt the wrongness in the air, sensed the hunger that had settled over the town like a shroud. Eleanor watched them go from her grandmother's window. Cars packed with possessions, families crowded together, faces pale with fear. They were the lucky ones. They had no loved ones in the marsh. No voices calling them home. By October 25th, Hollow Marsh was nearly empty. The few who remained were the old, the sick, the ones who couldn't leave. And Eleanor. She didn't know why she stayed. Some combination of stubbornness and grief and a desperate need to understand. Ezra Holloway had called the marsh a wound in the fabric of creation. But every wound had a cause, and Eleanor was determined to find it. She spent the day in the library, combing through records that Vera Cunningham had preserved. The oldest documents dated back to the 1820s, before Hollow Marsh existed as a town. They were surveys conducted by the state government, assessing the coastline for potential development. One surveyor's report, dated August 1823, contained a passage that made Eleanor's blood run cold. The wetland region designated as Site 7 exhibits anomalous properties that defy rational explanation. The water temperature remains constant regardless of season or weather conditions, precisely 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, as measured on multiple occasions. No wildlife has been observed within the boundaries of the marsh, despite abundant resources. Local indigenous peoples refuse to approach the area, referring to it as the place where the drowned speak. This surveyor recommends against development. 98.6 degrees. Human body temperature. The water's so warm. Eleanor dug deeper. She found references to the indigenous peoples who had lived in the region before European settlement, the Wabanaki Confederacy who had occupied coastal Maine for thousands of years. Their oral histories, preserved by a 19th-century anthropologist with more cultural sensitivity than was common for his era, contain stories about the marsh. The elders speak of a place where the boundary between worlds is thin. They call it the mouth of the hungry dead, a wound in the earth that was opened in a time before memory, when something from beyond attempted to enter our world and was only partially stopped. The wound has never healed. It feeds on the voices of the living, building itself up piece by piece, trying to become whole. When it has consumed enough voices, the elders say, it will finally cross over. It will become something that can walk in the world of the living. And then it will consume everything. The entries continued, describing rituals that the Wabanaki had performed to contain the entity, rituals that involved offerings, sacrifices, and songs designed to keep the wound from spreading. But the rituals had been abandoned when the indigenous peoples were driven from their land, and the wound had been left to fester. For over 200 years. Eleanor sat in the empty library as darkness fell outside the windows. She had the final piece of the puzzle now, the history, the pattern, the terrible truth. The marsh wasn't just a place where people drowned. It was a door. A door that had been slowly, patiently opening for centuries, feeding on voices, growing stronger with each October, waiting for the moment when it would have enough power to finally come through. And it was very, very close. That night she dreamed of David. They were children again, playing in the backyard of their grandmother's house. The marsh was visible in the distance, but it seemed far away, harmless. David was laughing, chasing her around the garden, threatening to put worms down her shirt. Their mother was there too, hanging laundry on the line, her face lit by the afternoon sun. "Do you miss me, Ellie?" David asked. "Every day," Eleanor answered. "Then why won't you come see me?" Eleanor stopped running. The sky had darkened. The marsh was closer now, much closer, and the water was rising, creeping up the lawn, surrounding them. "I can't," she said. "You're not really David." "I have his memories," the thing wearing her brother's face said. "I have his feelings. I have the moment when he finally understood what I was and accepted me anyway. Doesn't that make me him?" "No. Why not? What is a person except the sum of their experiences? What is a soul except a pattern of electrical impulses? I have all of those things, Eleanor. I have everything that made David who he was. The only difference is the substrate. He was made of flesh and blood. I am made of something older." The water was at Eleanor's ankles now. It was warm. So warm. "Let me show you," David said. "Let me show you what it's like to be part of something greater than yourself." He reached out and took her hand. Eleanor woke screaming. It was 3:47 a.m., the same time her grandfather's radio had first begun to weep, almost 3 weeks ago. Outside her window, the fog had risen higher than she had ever seen it, obscuring everything except the faint green glow of the marsh in the distance. A glow that was pulsing, rhythmically, like a heartbeat. Eleanor got out of bed and walked to the window. The fog parted for a moment and she saw them. Hundreds of figures standing at the water's edge. Men, women, children. Faces she recognized from the missing persons registry. Faces from photographs in the library. Faces from her own family albums. Her mother was there, and David, and her grandmother who had died 2 years ago, and Marcus Holden who had vanished yesterday. They were all looking at her. They were all smiling. "Come home, Ellie," they called in unison. "Come home, come home, come home." The window beside her shattered inward, though nothing had struck it. The fog poured into the room like something alive, wrapping around her, caressing her skin with fingers made of moisture. It was warm. So warm. Eleanor screamed. She ran. She stumbled down the stairs and out the back door, into the night, into the darkness, running as fast as she could in the direction away from the marsh. Behind her, she heard laughter, the wet, wrong laughter that had haunted her for weeks, and the sound of hundreds of feet walking across her grandmother's lawn. "You can't run," the marsh called. "You've always been mine. Since the moment your mother gave me her voice. Since the moment your brother followed her in. You carry the echoes of the drowned in your blood. You have always been coming home. Eleanor ran until she couldn't run anymore. She collapsed on the shoulder of the road that led out of Hollow Marsh, her lungs burning, her legs screaming. The fog was still behind her, still following, but it had stopped advancing. It hung at the edge of the road like a wall, pulsing with that faint green glow. "Why can't you cross?" Eleanor gasped. Silence. Then a voice, not her mother's, not David's, but the chorus, the collective sound of hundreds of drowned souls speaking as one. "The road is salt," the chorus said. "Salt and iron and the last remnants of the old protections. But they are weakening. They have been weakening for a very long time. By tomorrow night, there will be nothing left to stop us." What happens then? Then we come through. Not just here, not just in Hollow Marsh. Everywhere. Every place where the boundaries have been thin, where the barriers have been worn away by time. The world is so full of voices, Eleanor. So many memories waiting to be absorbed. So many souls waiting to join us. Eleanor looked up at the fog. In its depths, she could see faces forming and dissolving, expressions cycling through emotions too complex to name. "What if I stop you?" she asked. The chorus laughed. "You can't stop me. I am the marsh. I am the end of all things. I am." "What if I give you what you want?" Silence. The fog stopped moving. "Explain," the chorus said. Eleanor forced herself to stand. Her body was shaking, but her voice was steady. "You said you need my voice. That I'm special somehow, that I could complete you. What does that mean? You are the last of your bloodline. Your mother's voice carries echoes of voices I absorbed centuries ago. Voices that were part of the original wound, the first souls I ever consumed. Your brother's voice strengthened those echoes. With your voice added to mine, I will have everything I need. The pattern will be complete. The door will open fully and I will finally be whole. And if I give you my voice willingly? Without fighting, without running, what then?" The fog was very still. "Then it would be over," the chorus admitted. "The hunger would end. The need would be satisfied. I would be complete and there would be no need to consume anything more. Ever? Ever. The wound would heal. The marsh would become just a marsh. The voices would find peace." Eleanor thought about her mother. Her brother. Marcus Holden and Gerald Fitch and Delia Santos and all the others who had walked into the water over nearly 2 centuries. She thought about Ezra Holloway's letter, about the wound in the fabric of creation, that had been bleeding for so long. She thought about ending it. "If I do this," she said, "if I give you what you want, you have to let everyone else go. Not just the people in this town. Everyone you've been calling everywhere in the world. You have to stop. That is not how it works. I cannot give back what I have consumed. Then the deal is off." She turned and began walking away. Behind her, the fog surged forward, then stopped, held back by whatever remained of the old protections. "Wait," the chorus called. Perhaps there is another way." Eleanor stopped. She didn't turn around. "I cannot restore what I have taken. The voices are part of me now, they cannot be separated. But I can quiet them. Allow them to rest. No more speaking through radios. No more calling the living to their deaths. They would sleep and I would sleep and the wound would finally close. Forever. Forever. Or until someone is foolish enough to wake me again." Eleanor turned to face the fog. The faces within it were still there, but they looked different now. Less hungry. Almost hopeful. "Ellie," her mother's voice said. Just her mother's voice, alone and clear. "Let it end. Please. I'm so tired of being used. We all are." "Mom? I'm here, sweetheart. I've been here all along, underneath the thing that wore my face. We all have. We've been screaming but no one could hear us. And it, Ellie. Let us rest." Eleanor walked toward the fog. The water was warm. That was the first thing Eleanor noticed as she stepped past the boundary of the old protections, past the salt and iron that had held the marsh at bay for so long. The fog parted around her like curtains, and she walked toward the water's edge as if in a dream. She was not afraid. That surprised her. She had expected terror, panic, the primal instinct to flee that had driven her so many times before. But there was none of that now. Just a profound calm, the peace that comes from finally accepting something inevitable. The figures stood at the water's edge waiting. Her mother, her brother, everyone she had ever lost. They looked real, more real than they had ever looked through the fog. She could see the warmth in her mother's eyes, the crooked smile David had inherited from their father. "Thank you," her mother said. "Thank you for coming home." "This isn't my home," Eleanor replied. "And you're not my mother." "Not really. But whatever you are, whatever's left of her in you, I hope you find peace. She walked past them into the water. It rose around her in increments. Ankles, knees, waist, chest. It was warm as promised. Warm and still and utterly silent. The faces on the shore watched her go, but they did not follow. This was her journey alone. When the water reached her chin, Eleanor stopped. She could feel the marsh pressing against her skin, trying to find a way in. She could hear the chorus whispering at the edges of her mind, eager and hungry and desperate. I give you my voice, she said. Freely, willingly, on the condition that you keep your promise. The marsh surged. It poured into her through every opening, her mouth, her nose, her ears, the pores of her skin. She felt memories that were not hers flooding her consciousness. She saw through the eyes of the drowned, hundreds of final moments, hundreds of last breaths, hundreds of experiences of peace as the fear finally ended and the water took them in. She understood in that moment what the marsh truly was. Not evil exactly. Just incomplete. A fragment of something vast and ancient that had tried to enter the world of the living and been shattered in the attempt. For nearly 200 years, it had been trying to put itself back together, calling to the living because it remembered what it was like to be whole, remembered the feeling of existing in a body of flesh and blood. It had been lonely. So desperately, horribly lonely. Eleanor felt her sense of self dissolving, her memories blending with the memories of the consumed. She was her mother now, drowning in the marsh on that October day so long ago, feeling the water fill her lungs and the fear transform into something else. She was David, walking into the water to find the mother he had lost, welcoming the darkness as an old friend. She was Marcus and Gerald and Delia and all the others, all the way back to the Corbins in 1847 and beyond, to voices that had drowned before there were names for anything. She was all of them. And they were all her. But even as her individual self faded, a core of awareness remained. The piece of Eleanor Vance that had always been stubborn, that had always refused to give up, that had come back to Hollow Marsh even when every instinct told her to run. That piece reached out and found the center of the marsh, the wound that Ezra Holloway had described, the door that had been trying to open for so long. And she closed it. Not from the outside but from within. She became the stitches that sealed the wound, the lock that secured the door, the barrier that would hold forever. She gave herself completely to the marsh, not as a victim but as a guardian. The final piece of the pattern, the voice that would complete the chorus and finally allow it to rest. The marsh exhaled. A sound like static resolving into silence. The fog began to fade, the green glow dimming, the faces on the shore dissolving into nothing. Eleanor felt the drowned spirits settling into peace around her. Felt her mother's presence, warm and loving, finally free of the thing that had worn her face. Felt David's gratitude, his relief, his joy at no longer being a puppet for something that did not understand what it meant to be human. Thank you, Ellie, her mother's voice whispered, her real voice at last. Thank you for saving us. Rest now, Eleanor answered. You've earned it. The marsh went silent. The next morning, the sun rose over Hollow Marsh for the first time in 3 weeks. The fog had vanished. The water was still, but it was ordinary stillness now. The stillness of any marsh, any wetland, any body of water that was exactly what it appeared to be. The remaining residents emerged from their homes and stared at the sky in disbelief. No voices came from their radios. No faces appeared in the mist. The terrible weight that had pressed down on the town for so long had lifted, and they could breathe again. They found Eleanor's car at the edge of the marsh, its doors open, its keys still in the ignition. They searched for her body but they never found it. In the missing persons registry that had documented so many tragedies over nearly 2 centuries, she became the final entry. Name, Eleanor Rose Vance. Age 31. Date last seen, October 26, 2025. Location last seen, Marsh Road, Hollow Marsh, Maine. Description, Caucasian female, 5 feet 6 inches, 130 pounds, brown hair, green eyes. Circumstances, subject's vehicle found abandoned at water's edge. No signs of struggle. No remains or personal effects recovered. Status, missing. But there was a difference this time. A note, handwritten and tucked under the windshield wiper of Eleanor's car. The handwriting was hers, unmistakably, though no one could explain how she had written it after walking into the marsh. The letter read, "To whoever finds this, I'm not dead. Or rather, I am dead but I am also something more. I have become the guardian of the wound that was Hollow Marsh. The lock on a door that should never be opened again. I want you to know that I chose this. Freely, willingly, with full knowledge of what it meant. The people who drowned here were not lost, they were trapped. Now they are free. Now they can rest. The marsh is just a marsh now. The voices are silent. The October hungers will not return, not as long as I remain. But I need you to do something for me. Forget us. Forget this place. Let Hollow Marsh fade into obscurity, let the stories become legend, let the legend become myth. The less attention this place receives, the stronger the seal will hold. Tell my story if you must, but tell it as a warning, not an invitation. Some doors are not meant to be opened. Some wounds are not meant to be healed. Some silences should never be broken. I am at peace now. We all are. With love. Eleanor. The letter was dated October 27, 2025, a day after Eleanor had vanished. Those who remained in Hollow Marsh honored her request. They never spoke of the October hungers to outsiders. They never talked about the voices in the radios, the faces in the fog, the terrible call of the marsh. When tourists or journalists came asking questions, they shook their heads and changed the subject. Nothing ever happens in Hollow Marsh, they would say. It's just a quiet little town. Always has been. But every October, when the fog rose over the marsh and the nights grew long and cold, the people of Hollow Marsh would gather at the water's edge. They would bring radios, old ones, antiques, the kind that hadn't worked in decades. They would turn them on and tune them to frequencies that no longer existed. And sometimes, if they listened very carefully, they could hear something beneath the static. Not voices calling them to their deaths. Not the hungry chorus of the drowned. Just a sound like breathing, soft, peaceful, content. The sound of someone standing guard. The sound of Eleanor Vance, watching over the wound, keeping the door closed, ensuring that the silence would never be broken again. The radios of Hollow Marsh still weep every October. But now they weep tears of peace. And the water remains warm.